10 meters beneath the surface, encased in a crushing, obsidian silence, Dan Frolec strained to hear the muffled thrum of a boat engine far above. A rhythmic pulse that felt like the heartbeat of a world he was rapidly losing. It had been 30 agonizing minutes since his friend Tom vanished into a jagged limestone abyss to search for their companion, Michael, in the absolute stillness of the Adriatic. The hydrostatic pressure exerts a physical weight against the glass of a diving mask. Frolec felt the first cold prickle of dread. Perhaps the cavern hadn't just claimed Michael. Perhaps it had swallowed Tom as well, leaving Dan isolated in this liquid void. Suddenly, a cluster of bubbles struck his mask. Mercurial and frantic in the gloom, someone was ascending. A dim, swaying beam flickered from the gullet of the grotto, and Tom emerged alone. He offered a slow, somber shake of the head, the universal signal of defeat. Michael was still missing, and by now, his oxygen supply was undoubtedly depleted. Little did Frolec realize that, as he broke the surface into the midnight air of Poganica Bay, his ordeal was merely evolving. He was transitioning from a battle against the elements to a struggle against a state-sponsored frame-up. He was stepping out of a watery grave only to walk toward a prison cell, facing 40 years for a homicide that never occurred. The Croatian coastline is a serrated masterpiece of carbonate rock and brine, a landscape where mountains appear to plummet directly into the surf. In the summer of 2002, Dan Frolec was a 32-year-old Czech national seeking to mute the cacophony in his mind. Career demands were relentless, and his romantic life had reached a pivotal junction. He had recently opted to commit fully to Yarka, a woman he'd met a year prior. It was an electric, undeniable connection. Earlier that day, basking in the Mediterranean radiance, he had sent her a brief text. "I love you, Fox." It was a message of optimism sent from a vessel teeming with comrades who shared a singular obsession with the abyss. The crew of the Domani were seasoned explorers. There was Tom, the veteran, Ivo, Dan's close confidant, Marek, the skipper, and the witty, reserved Michael. They were a generation of Czechs who had come of age in a landlocked nation and were now compensating for lost time in the expansive ocean. As the afternoon light mellowed into amber, Captain Marek unfurled a nautical chart. He indicated a hand-drawn circle near Poganica Bay. He had recently identified a dark, shallow aperture in the seabed, but hadn't ventured inward. In the subaquatic world, an unexplored crevice is a siren song. Despite the encroaching evening chill and a sun hovering precariously low, the group's inquisitiveness was ignited. They opted for a fleeting sunset reconnaissance. It was supposed to be a quick dip. Those are the famous last words of many a diver. The team geared up while Dan, Ivo, and Marek remained topside. Michael was among the first to submerge. 45 minutes later, he broke the surface, his expression radiant with the dopamine hit of discovery. He reported that the hole led to a sea cavern, a labyrinthine system of domes and galleries. He required more equipment. He seized a torch, a dive computer to monitor his decompression profile, and a fresh cylinder. He plunged back in. Frolec didn't protest. The cardinal rule is to always utilize the buddy system. But in the fervor of exploration, protocols are often the first things to drown. Michael disappeared back into the depths with a frantic vitality that should have been a glaring red flag. Another 45 minutes elapsed. The sun had retreated, cloaking the bay in a shroud of deep indigo. Finally, the other explorers surfaced. They hauled themselves onto the Domani, saturated and spent. But as the head count commenced, a chilling realization took root. One seat was empty. Michael was not among them. Tom explained they had retreated early. The cavern was a chaotic maze of two massive chambers and a corridor far too treacherous for a nocturnal excursion without specialized gear. When Dan informed them that Michael had returned to the depth specifically to locate them, the atmosphere on the deck shifted from fatigue to sheer panic. Michael was down there solo. He possessed no partner. He was navigating with a basic plastic flashlight instead of a high-output cave light. Most critically, his hour of air was a finite, rapidly hemorrhaging resource. The bay, once scenic, now felt like a predatory organism waiting in the shadows. The sky turned a bruising midnight blue as Dan and Tom donned their neoprene, while the rest of the crew piloted the Domani in wide arcs, praying Michael had discovered an air pocket or reached a nearby shoreline. Dan and Tom swam back to the chimney, the constricted vertical portal of the cave. Tom, outfitted with technical gear, descended into the blackness. Dan remained at the threshold, 10 meters down, clutching a secondary tank. He was a sentinel at the gates of the abyss. He later described those 40 minutes as the most agonizing of his existence. Though not a religious man, as he stared into that lightless vacuum, a single plea cycled through his mind. If there is any divinity, Michael needs your intervention. He watched his own exhalations rise, the only movement in a frozen world. But the deep offered no reply. When Tom finally surfaced alone, his gestures were heavy with the burden of what he hadn't found. They ascended sluggishly, the silence between them more deafening than the roar of their regulators. They contacted the Croatian Coast Guard, only to receive a devastating response. Help wouldn't arrive until dawn. When the authorities finally arrived with the first rays of light, the tragedy pivoted from a rescue to a bureaucratic nightmare. Marek detailed the cave's topography, and Tom, the specialist, tried to caution the commander. The Coast Guard divers were prepping to enter the aperture using standard recreational gear, single cylinders and basic illumination. It was woefully insufficient for a silt-clogged cavern. Tom pleaded with them, emphasizing the hazard of a silt out, where fine sediment obliterates visibility. His counsel was dismissed with the arrogance of local authority. The two Navy divers submerged. One stood watch at the entrance, while the other penetrated the tunnel. An hour passed. Suddenly, the diver at the portal surfaced, screaming in Croatian. His partner had vanished. The cave had claimed a second casualty. In an act of desperate gallantry, Dan and Tom geared up again. They dove into the chimney to assist, but visibility was now non-existent. The previous movements had churned the fine sediment into a thick, opaque slurry. It was like swimming through liquid charcoal. They were forced to retreat. As the group was escorted to the pier, they anticipated the somber empathy usually reserved for witnesses of a disaster. Instead, they met a phalanx of officers and a glacial, interrogative glare. They were detained and isolated. Dan assumed this was protocol for a double fatality, but the following morning, the tone shifted from inquiry to indictment. He was ushered into a room for a polygraph examination. Sensors were calibrated. Wires were attached to his fingertips. The questions weren't about the rescue. They were sharp, accusatory barbs. How did Michael die? Did you know he was punctured with a blade? Was it your knife? Did you murder him? The shock was a visceral impact. The police weren't investigating a casualty. They were manufacturing a culprit. The Navy had lost a man, and the most efficient way to mask a breach in safety protocol was to fabricate a crime. Dan, shattered and mourning, failed the polygraph. To the investigators, his physiological response to the horror of the allegation was the definitive proof of his malice. The catastrophe was no longer a private heartbreak. It had mutated into a public scandal that demanded a villain. Dan was hauled to a police facility where his diving equipment had been discarded in a heap. He scrambled to find his dive computer. That electronic device was his silent alibi. Its internal logs would verify his exact depth and duration, proving he never entered the cavern and could not have assaulted Michael. But the device was missing. An officer stated it had been seized as evidence. The realization sank in like a lead weight. He was being framed. Manacles were cinched around his wrists. He and Ivo were brought before a magistrate who informed them they would be incarcerated for at least a month. No trial, no bail, just the frigid masonry of a Croatian penitentiary. Dan hadn't brushed his teeth in 72 hours. It was a minor domestic indignity, but it became the catalyst for his lost autonomy. The cell was a brutal systemic shock. Dan and Ivo were housed with 2 narcotics traffickers and a man awaiting trial for uxoricide. The inmates mockingly dubbed their quarters the 2 dealers, 2 killers suite. Despite the grim charges, a strange survivalist pragmatism emerged. They traded jests and watched The Simpsons on a flickering television, a surreal fragment of pop culture in a Balkan jail. However, the external world was far more ruthless. A tabloid arrived featuring the Domani on the front page. Their names were printed in bold ink. A fabricated narrative began to permeate the media, a homosexual love triangle gone tragic. It was a story designed to provoke hostility from other inmates, leading to verbal assaults and a sense of total abandonment. Dan contemplated the prospect of 4 decades in this room. In the vacuum of a foreign prison, truth felt like a luxury the state couldn't afford to acknowledge. While Dan languished in his cell, Yarka was enduring her own version of the nightmare. She had received a frantic call from the Czech consul and had to perform the harrowing task of informing Dan's parents. As she spoke, Dan's face flickered on the evening news. It was a total disintegration of the future they had envisioned. When she was finally permitted to visit, the stoicism Dan had cultivated shattered. They wept through the reinforced glass. But Yarka was not paralyzed. She vowed to secure elite legal counsel and dismantle the narrative of bloodstains the police claimed to have discovered on the vessel. To preserve his sanity, Dan purchased a notebook from the commissary. It was a juvenile notebook featuring Cinderella on the cover. In its pages, he documented the absurdity of his condition. The dealers bartering antidepressants like gold, the paranoia of a post-9/11 world, and the crushing gravity of the silence. He was a man caught between a storybook and a life sentence. He focused on the physics of the evidence. The police cited red discoloration on the Domani as Michael's blood. Dan knew it was merely oxidation from the mooring cables. But until the forensic results arrived, he was a ghost in the machine. After 27 days, the gears of justice finally groaned to a halt. The remains had been extracted from the grotto. The truth was inscribed in the logs of Michael's own dive computer, which had finally been decrypted. It verified that Michael had remained alive for 30 minutes within the dome, frantically scouring for an escape before his air failed. He hadn't been assassinated. He had been disoriented. The stab wounds cited by the police were actually self-inflicted, the final, desperate act of a man facing the slow agony of asphyxiation, opting for a swifter conclusion. The DNA analysis on the boat confirmed what Dan already knew. It was rust. The warden opened the cell door and uttered, "It's your time." Dan and Ivo were released into a world that felt blindingly luminous. They shared a meal with their lawyers, a simple act of autonomy that felt like a secular miracle. The return to Prague was a chaotic media frenzy. But once the flashbulbs ceased, Dan possessed a revamped perspective on existence. He didn't just survive the cavern. He survived a mechanism that attempted to bury him alongside his friend. He realized that liberty isn't the absence of barriers, but the presence of agency. He wed Jarka, and they relocated to Bali, as far from the landlocked pressures of Central Europe as possible. He still plunges into the crystalline waters of the Indian Ocean, but he maintains a rigid boundary regarding caves. The mystery hole in Poganica Bay had taught him that some voids are better left unexamined. He visited Michael's mother with a framed photograph he had captured on the boat hours before the descent. It displayed Michael grinning, vibrant, and full of life. A small fragment of the man, to replace the caricature the tabloids had manufactured. 2 decades later, the salt has evaporated, but the resonance of that silence persists. Dan eventually sought professional cave diving certification in Florida. He didn't do it to resume exploration. He did it because he loathed the memory of feeling impotent while waiting at the chimney. He wanted to comprehend the adversary that had claimed his friend and nearly erased his future. Survival, he realized, isn't just about breathing. It's about what you do with the oxygen you have left. Every year, he reunites with Ivo in Prague. They share a lager and discuss their children and the mundane trivialities of the present. The topic of Croatia arises with decreasing frequency. They are 2 men who walked into the shadow of a 40-year sentence and emerged again, pragmatic and profoundly grateful. The ocean is indifferent to our motivations, but the human spirit is a stubborn fusion of physics and hope. The saga of Dan Frolec proves that the most hazardous element of a survival situation isn't always the environment. It's the narrative others construct about you once the silence falls. What salvaged him wasn't just the data. It was the refusal to let the darkness of the abyss extinguish the light of his character.